Нам большая честь сегодня спикер, который сейчас скоро будет представлен. Мы проводим в Сколково целый ряд открытых лекций такого типа на целый большой круг таких тем глобального характера. И мы очень рады, что пришел сегодня доктор Meadow, о котором мы услышим подробнее.
This is something like my 50th visit to Moscow. I came here the first time in 1970. And I have had many friends and many professional colleagues first in the Soviet Union and then in Russia over that time. I've given hundreds of speeches in this country, but this is the first time today that I'm going to speak about these issues with an audience which is mainly composed of business students. Why? Because back in 1972, when we first did this work, the problems, the topics of interest to me lay in the future, 30, 40 years into the future. And most business students aren't interested in 30 or 40 years into the future. They, by training, need to do things over the next 3 or 5 years or so. But now, here in 2012, those problems which were in the distant future back in 1970 are coming soon. Now they are within the time period of interest, even to business people. They're very interesting to me. I have been a business professor for 40 years. I was professor of engineering for 30 years, simultaneously. I am a consultant now to a large investment firm in Germany. In the United States, I'm a venture capitalist. I work with small companies, startups, trying to find how to take interesting ideas, put them into a business, and make them grow and become useful and profitable. So I spend a lot of time trying to understand the connection between these long-term problems and short-term opportunities. Of course, I can't tell you today precisely what you should do, but I hope I can open up your mind to some new ideas so that when you leave here, you will have the perspectives necessary to create businesses and be useful in this society. Here's what I'm going to do today. So I will start briefly with some main conclusions from the Club of Rome study, which was conducted by me and my team. I had 17 scientists working at MIT for 2 years back in 1970. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the forces which I see coming, which are going to shape the economic and the market and the political climate of Russia and the other great industrial countries. I'll focus on 2 forces which I know are going to be very important in this country. Russia is a very special country, as you will see. I will mention how it differs in some important ways, but all of us are going to be affected by these forces: energy scarcity and climate change. Then I'll talk briefly, what do I really mean by limits? Limits is not when you dig a hole looking for some oil or gold or something and the hole is empty. No, that's not limits. Limits is when these resources become so expensive that they're no longer useful to us. Most of the oil, most of the gold, most of the copper that's in the ground now will still be in the ground 100 or 200 years from now. but it won't be useful to us because it can't be made economically productive. So I'll talk about that. And then finally, thinking how this creates a context for new business. Ways to be useful. Before I get into the details of my speech, I would like to do a very quick exercise to give you some practice in understanding what I say. I have invented a cipher, a new kind of secret code. I'm going to use that cipher to show you numbers. And to make it very simple, I will only show you numbers between 1 and 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Your goal is to learn what is my cipher so that when I show you a number, you can understand the right number. Of course, the first couple times, probably you make a mistake. But I hope quickly you learn the cipher. It's something like my speech. I'm going to be showing you a lot of numbers and conclusions, and you need to understand them in a new way to take meaning out for your own activities. So, now I'm going to show you a number between 1 and 5 using my secret code, and then I'm going to ask each of you in your mind, not speaking, but just thinking, what is the number? So you'll have to pick a number between 1 and 5 you think I'm showing you, and then I ask, okay. What number am I showing you? I'm showing you 4. How many people thought I was showing you 4? So, about 20%, which is what you would expect from a totally random process. Let's try it again. What number am I showing you? I'm showing you 1. How many people thought I was showing you 1? Oh, even less. Now I'm showing you 2. Now what am I showing? 3. You see, the code is very simple if you look outside the box. If you look only inside the box, you never understand this code. The leaders of today, the people who are governing us, who are government leaders, corporate leaders, also unfortunately university leaders, they like to give you a box and then tell you something that you should look at inside the box. Why? Because they know a lot about what's inside the box, and then they can be like an expert. In fact, the things that are important to you are outside the box. And as long as you are willing to look outside, rather quickly you'll begin to see the meaning of what's happening in this world. I'm going to hope that today I can open up your eyes a little bit to that. In 1972, I came to Moscow and I showed this diagram. I didn't, of course, have LCD projector and laptop computer, but it was identically the same diagram. It's figure number 35 from our scientific report, which we published in 1972. I have only added 2 things, those 2 red lines. So this line and this line. Here is where we were in 1972. Notice that in 1972, the global system still had about 40 years for growth and progress. That's why it wasn't very interesting to talk to business students back in 1970 about this, because their attitude, which is perfectly natural attitude, is, no problem for me. I make my company, I get rich, and by the time these things come, it's no concern for me. In 1972, we said that the policies which have produced enormous progress, increased food consumption, increased material standard of living, increased energy, and so forth, those policies, if they are continued, in the early part of this century, 21st century, start to cause big difficulties. So we said in 1972, you have to change. Well, there was no change. And so the trends continued, and now we're here. And now we start to see the consequences. This was not the only picture that we showed of the future, because it's actually impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen for the global system. We published in our report 13 different scenarios. So this is one scenario, and there were 12 more. But unfortunately, since we didn't make any changes, it seems that the world is following that scenario. Recently in Australia, the main government scientific institute conducted an empirical study. They looked at global data and compared the global data against our scenarios. We did a sustainable development equilibrium scenario and this one I call overshoot scenario. And you can see in this report, this is a page, actually this was published by the Netherlands Environmental Agency. They took the data from the Australian study. They showed two scenarios from our book. The blue is, in each case, is the equilibrium scenario for population, industrial output, non-renewable resources, and pollution. And the green line is the overshoot scenario for those four. And so far, the global data shows that we're moving along on the overshoot scenario. Now, to say this doesn't mean necessarily, for example, that Russia would overshoot. You know, although Russia is an enormous, large country, it has only about 140 million people in a globe with 7 billion. So you are something like 2% of the population of the globe. Absolutely possible to imagine that 2% of the people, if they operate in a good way, can avoid problems which come to most. Not totally. If the globe destroys its climate, the climate of Russia is also going to be changed. But if the globe, for example, does not manage its energy system, it's still within the possibility that Russia would do an excellent job managing it. And the globe could run out of food, but Russia could have enough food. So you have still some possibility inside this country. The important thing to know is that the time for these choices is now. When you look at my overshoot scenario, it goes up and then it comes back down again. It's easy to imagine that the really big difficulties will be after the peak. But this isn't the situation, unfortunately. The time of greatest stress is now. You see, population and industrial activity are now being pushed by many policies, government policies, market policies, and so forth. The globe is finite. our planet is big, but it is limited finally. And so this growth has to come to an end. And the way it will come to an end is when the forces which are stopping growth equal the forces which are pushing growth. That's very simplistic statics, but it works also at the global level. The forces pushing growth are strongest now, not after the peak. And so it means that problems will have to become most powerful now. So some of you will graduate from this university over the next months and start out into a professional life. Your professional life will be 40 or 50 years. During that time, these forces will grow very strong. They will stop growth, and then we will come into a period where we start to find a new equilibrium. What will that look like? Well, we don't know precisely. It was certainly impossible during the Tsarist time, back, let's say, in 1905, to have any imagination about what the communist period would look like in this country. And during the communist time, it was very difficult to know what it would look like now in this current period. So we also don't have the possibility to have a detailed and precise understanding of what's coming next. But the political and the economic system of Russia changed drastically twice in the last 100 years. For sure it's going to change again. I mean, we couldn't imagine that suddenly after 2,000 years of change, now everything is going to be constant. So it's coming. There will be another change, and it will come during your lifetime. Some people think change is bad. I think it's an opportunity. It opens up the possibilities for innovation in many fronts. And so I'm actually interested in the phenomenon of change. And my speech today is trying to give you some idea of where this change is going to come so that you can be ready. I just said in my last point here, just to try to give some sense about this, you will see more change in the next 20 years than was seen in the last 100. Now, when I used to say that, people thought I was crazy. Probably they still think I'm crazy. But, just imagine, I remember I was here in 2007, so 5 years ago I was in Moscow. I said this at that time. I said, in the next 20 years, you will see this much change. Since then, what happened? The global financial system almost collapsed. The U.S. government took over the ownership of the U.S. car industry. And now we're moving into a period which will see the end of the Eurozone. So, we are in a period of change. But the problem is, when it unfolds over 5 or 10 or 15 years, each day you get up, you look at the paper or you look at the television, and it seems like it is the same today as it was yesterday, so you start to imagine nothing is changing. No, it's just that it's changing over 5 or 10 years. So what's causing it to change? Well, I will pick two forces because I know they're going to be very important. And then just to illustrate that there are lots of other things to think about, I mentioned some things which I don't talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about global oil production, energy limits, and also global climate change. The first is very important to you because, as you know, Russia gets about 70% of its export earnings from the export of resources, and most of that is oil and gas. So the health of the global oil system has enormous consequences for Russia. And the second one is important because it will influence food production and migration. And both of those are issues very interesting to Russia. I'm not going to talk about some other things. For example, every 100 years or so, there's usually a big volcanic eruption, which puts a lot of dust in the air and has a big influence on food production and climate. Certainly, it will happen again in the future. I don't talk about that. In the 1800s, there was an eruption from the sun, which put enough electromagnetic energy onto the Earth that if it happened today, it would destroy the electrical system. It will happen again. I hope not during our lifetime. I don't talk about it. Epidemics are another thing which could have global influence, but I don't speak about these things. I'm hoping myself that in my lifetime these are not important. So let's talk about global oil production. And let me say, I'm going to give you some scientific data. It's empirical data, not my guess, but from the statistics. And then I use it to make some forecasts. Probably you won't like my forecast, but I tell you a little story. This is a book. It's in Russian. It says USSR and Russia. It was published by a professional colleague of mine who is a systems scientist here in Moscow. He talks about the Soviet time in this book. Only now it's possible to do that because this information was classified during the Soviet time. Actually, I'm seeing it for the first time myself. I didn't know about it back then. And in this book, my friend Victor tells how he took my model, made changes, and used it to think about the future of the Soviet system. And he discovered from his model that a period of great difficulty was coming. He was doing this work in the late 70s and early 80s. So he went to the leadership of the country and he said, my forecasts show that you don't have any possibility. You have to change your policies. The leaders said, no, we have another possibility. You can change your forecast. So my friend didn't change his forecast, and the leaders didn't change their policies, and now we have the benefits of a new system. I'm not going to change my forecast. You can decide whether or not you want the benefits of a new system. Global oil production is now falling. Probably it peaked out in about 2006. Even in Russia, which has enormous oil resources, we see the limits. Putin recently estimated that it would require $280 billion over the next 10 years to keep Russian oil production at current levels. That's almost 7 or 8 trillion rubles, just to hold it constant. Most other countries don't have the possibility of holding it constant. In the United States now, we're in a period of decline. The United States used to be the world's largest oil producer, and there was a time when we were also the world's largest oil exporter, which of course now Russia is the world's largest oil exporter. But we used up the oil, and now we're in a period of decline. You can see the consequences of this. On the left is a picture of the global energy system. A lot of information, but two things are important. Most of the global energy system is using fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil. Almost 90%. Nuclear is 5%. Big dams, big hydropower dams, about 6%. And then so-called renewables, solar energy mainly, just 1.32%. And most of that is the burning of wood, which we've been doing for a century. It means that geothermal, using the heat from the earth, solar and wind are very small. And some of these are unique. For example, the transportation system doesn't operate except with oil. There's no way you can use solar power for running airplanes and trucks and so forth. So if this starts to go down, it means global energy consumption is going to go down because there is no possibility to make enough growth in these areas or to achieve enough gains in efficiency to offset the difference. And this is going to go down. Every year since 1984, so that's last 25 years practically, the amount of oil which has been consumed around the globe has been greater than the amount of oil which has been discovered. You can't use oil if you don't discover it. You know, it's one thing to talk in theory about enormous amounts of oil under the ground. But if it stays under the ground, it's not very useful to us. We aren't able to use it for our cars, for our electricity plants, for our heating our houses and our buildings. We have to discover it, and then we have to bring it out and convert it and transport it. It takes typically about 10 or 12 years between when you discover oil and when it starts to be useful to you. We still discover oil, of course. Recently there was very much excitement about Brazil. Brazil discovered quite a bit of oil in the ocean off the coast of Brazil in South America. That oil will be very important to Brazil, and it will be very important to some companies. Petrobras, the Brazilian oil company, will make billions of dollars from this oil. But if you took all of that oil and put it into the global system, it would satisfy needs for something around 2 months. So it's not a significant solution for the oil problem. We discovered a lot of oil back in this period, between 30 and 70. You see the amounts which are added, and slowly the consumption has been growing. And in 1984, consumption became greater, and this red shows the difference. Oil discoveries peaked in 1960s. That's when the big Siberian fields were found, some of them. Every year since '84, consumption has exceeded discovery. Just to give you some perspective, in 2009, we discovered about 5 billion barrels, and in 2009, the globe used about 31 billion barrels. So we used up 26 billion barrels of that oil which had been discovered in the old days. There are thousands of oil fields, but most oil comes from a few really big ones. And we aren't finding those anymore. Of the 20 largest fields, 18 were discovered in the period 1917 to 1968. 2 were discovered in the 1970s, and none of them since. You have made some significant oil discoveries out in the eastern part of the country of Russia, but they're not giant fields. And in most cases, you immediately contract with China to ship the oil to China. So it's not going to feed into the global system. The result of all this, you can see in the statistics. This is global oil production from 1995 up until 2009. And there was growth in the earlier period. Now the growth is almost finished. You can see it in this period. Now it's not going in. In the 5 years from 95 until 99, global oil production increased almost 6%. The next 5 years, actually, it increased 8%. But the last 5 years, just not even 1%. And now, actually, it seems to be in decline. And if we look ahead, not based on hopes, not based on the statements of politicians who don't want to worry about these problems, not based on the statements of OPEC, which wants to keep the world dependent on oil instead of other sources, but actually look at the physical deposits, then you conclude that over the next 20 years, oil production will decline, go down almost by half. That's done by a German think tank called Energy Watch Group. By 2012, surplus oil production could entirely disappear, and as early as 2015, the shortfall in output could reach nearly 10 million barrels per day. Global consumption is about 85 million barrels per day, so this would be around about 10%. And even the scientists now start to think about this. Science magazine is the leading basic science magazine in the United States, and just a year ago, they had a main article. The title was "Peak Oil Production May Already Be Here." And you start to see now the change. You know, after 100 years of practically constant prices, suddenly, let me say, just when I published my book, but I don't think there's any connection. In 1972, we had the embargo, and suddenly now we're in a period of very rapid oscillations. And even this data are a little bit old. You know now that oil is selling for about $100 a barrel. And there's no serious thinking that it's going to go back down very far. Actually, it's so interesting to be here because Russia is on exactly the opposite side from all of the other great industrial economies. You want the price to stay high because it gives you good export earnings, and everybody else wants it to be low because it's killing their balance of trade statistics. But for the moment it's high, and certainly I don't know what price Putin is thinking about when he makes his long-term financial projections, but at least we can say the price is going to stay high. It's going to be interesting to see how this develops, because for you, this has good news and bad news. The good news is when the price is high, it gives an enormous export earnings income to Russia, so a lot of money, dollars typically, comes in here, and which can be used for other purposes. On the other hand, when the price is high, it begins to damage the industrial economies which import energy, and their capacity to import goods and even to their demand for energy will start to be damaged. And we're now in a period where it's not clear how these two are going to balance out. The key thing is not to try to make a prediction, but to be prepared for a variety of different outcomes. And being prepared in that way is difficult because there's lots of other things going on. I won't talk about them in such detail, but the global climate is also changing. I know there's debate, especially in my country and in this country, about climate change, but I can tell you the scientific understanding is we are in a period of rapid change. And I predict we'll see three phases. First phase, people say there is no climate change. Second phase, they say, well, okay, there is climate change, but it isn't caused by humans. That's now starts to be the phase for Russia. The third phase will be, well, there is climate change, and it is caused by humans, but it's too late to do anything about it. That's the phase where we are now in the United States. Since the 1970s, each subsequent decade, each additional 10 years, has gotten hotter around the globe. And 9 of the 10 hottest years in history, recorded history, in this case, recorded history is about 120 years when we started gathering weather data, have occurred since the year 2000. And Trollof, who's the head of your weather bureau here, said in 2010 that the heat wave was the worst in 1,000 years of recorded Russian history. I wasn't here in 2010. You were here. You know what it was like. The important thing to know is that this statement is true, but it doesn't mean that you can wait 1,000 years before you have another one like that. Actually, with climate change, we expect to start having many very hot extended periods. In where I live, in north of Boston, we just had the warmest 3 months of winter in recorded history. It was never in history it was warmer than we had in January, February, and March. Of course, we liked it very much. It was very pleasant. We didn't have to shovel snow, etc. However, we also didn't get any snow, and now it's going to be very, very dry for the summer agricultural season. And you can see the data. This is plotting from roughly the last 130 years, from 1880 up to 2010. I know many people in Russia think climate change is a good idea because, you know, out in Siberia, for example, it would be good if it was a little bit warmer. This overlooks some important facts that a lot of the structures out there were built assuming that the ice would never melt in the soil. And also, climate change is more than temperature. It is temperature. We used to think that climate change might stimulate agriculture because the increasing CO2 would let the crops grow better. But we now have better information and see that a more important factor is temperature. High temperatures reduce plant growth. Therefore, for example, in 2010 in Russia, where the heat was concentrated, your grains production was cut by about 30%. That was the temperature effect. It permitted Russia to continue feeding its people, but it caused enormous problems for Egypt and some of the other countries which had gotten into the habit of buying food from you. Climate change will alter precipitation patterns. On average, precipitation will go up, but in some regions it will go up a lot, and in other regions down very much, and in almost all regions there will be much more oscillation, floods, and droughts. That will have a big influence on food production as well. It will start to move the cultivation zones. The temperature, which is required for certain kinds of crops, will tend to move north. In my region, we make agricultural maps to show what kind of crops to grow, and the suitable regions are drifting north. You can see it on the maps. It used to be that in Connecticut you could grow certain things, now you can grow those things in New Hampshire. Unfortunately, the sunlight doesn't also shift north with climate change, and so that we start to get problems of balance in our crop production. The oceans are becoming more acid because they are absorbing more CO2, and that starts to have really enormous consequences for fish and shellfish and for simple plankton. Winds become more unstable. You start to see much more wind damage. Hurricanes and so forth will be more common, tornadoes and so forth. Zones of ecological zones shift. Probably not a big problem in Moscow, the rising of the sea, but in some regions, very serious. Overall, it means big changes in human settlement patterns. We, over the last 200 years, have developed a pattern of settlements around the globe tailored to the weather. In very fertile areas, there's a lot of people, and in dry areas not. And now these areas are going to change. And for Russia, it will be very interesting because, of course, there's enormous population pressure down in China, an area which is going to get drier and therefore have more food problems. And they, I suppose, I don't talk to these guys, but they look north and see all of this empty land, so-called empty land up there. So there will start to be a lot more migration pressure. And food itself, food production will start to be an issue. So we can start to see problems. This is data from 1900 up to more or less the present. is gathered by Institute in Belgium, and it's just plotting how many natural disasters are reported in each year. You can see they talk about flood, windstorms, and so forth, and generally it shows that we're coming into a period of rapid change. We have to expect this curve will continue to go up. It's not going to turn around. Already the world has water problems. The red areas show where water is quite scarce. A lot of the United States has quite serious problems with water. We don't have big agricultural production out here. Our agriculture is in this region. And quite a lot of Russia has also issues with water. Most water is used by agriculture. This shows agriculture use, industrial use, and domestic use for the world, for the OECD countries, and for sub-Saharan Africa. You see they have no industry, so no industrial use. But the point is the bulk is used in agriculture. So I can tell you, one of the really interesting business opportunities is going to be understanding how to help agriculture cope with reduced water availability. Huge, huge market. Now, how do these limits actually affect us? I apologize, it's fairly technical, and I'm not going to be able to go through it in great detail, but I just give you the basic idea. Growth, and economic growth comes through the accumulation of capital, by building up capital in industry, in transport, in the residential and commercial sectors. If you don't have more capital, physical capital, you can't have growth. That capital is produced, by and large, by the industrial sector. You know, this business school isn't producing capital. It's producing trained people who will go out and work in industry. But until there's more cement, more steel, and more wood products and so forth, you're not going to have growth. So there's a loop here. Industrial capital produces output, and this output, this physical flow, can be used in different ways. It can be consumed, iPads and mobile phones and refrigerators and cars and so forth. It can go into the resource sector, oil wells, copper mines, the factories which are purifying gold and so forth. It can go into the agricultural sector where it produces food and fibers. It can go into services. This is service capital here. Or it can be reinvested. Can be reinvested. Only if the investment is greater than the depreciation do you get growth in the industrial capital stock and therefore growth in the economy. And for most of the last 200 years, the demand of these sectors was small enough that we could sustain growth around this loop. But now we're coming into a period where we have to spend more and more capital to get energy, to produce food, to cope with water shortages, and so forth. And you see, as the fraction goes down, the capital goes up. And the consequence of that is that we start to take a lot of the capital into these sectors, and not enough is left down here. And growth becomes much more difficult. In our model, when the peak comes and the decline starts, it's because the capital is being pulled off into other sectors. How could that happen? Well, let's look at the compensation for oil. Here's what determines oil consumption. Number of people, living standard, the amount of capital per person, the amount of energy required to operate the capital. You know, it takes electricity for the lights and gas for the cars and so forth. And then the fraction of the oil or energy which is coming from fossil fuels. In Russia, this is almost 100%. You have practically no renewable solar energy in this country. So, and actually, your energy efficiency is rather low by Western standards. So what's happening, and the main change in your population is constant, but actually constant. So in this country, here is the main driver, is the living standard goes up, energy consumption goes up. Now, when you begin to work on renewable, you benefit from technology. There's declining costs. This shows the cost of producing a certain amount of electricity from wind and from photovoltaics between 1980 roughly and the current. And so you see we're making some progress. But only if you put those in place, it's going to have an effect. Now, coming to the end, what does this mean for business? So, of course, I don't precisely know this question. If I did, I wouldn't be here. I would be out making investments, and trying to take advantage. I think, but I'm really speaking to the students in the audience. You're going to leave here. You need to pick a sector where you're going to work. Practically speaking, the first few years that you are outside of the school, you are gathering expertise. You're becoming familiar with the important people, the important legislation, the important technologies in some field. So it's very important. What field do you pick? Agriculture, energy, industry, services, banking. I mean, this is an important decision for you. Then, after you have some expertise, 4 or 5 years, then you can begin really to become personally involved. Here's where I see some interesting opportunities. So, take energy. Transportation is going to be more and more difficult, especially airline transportation. Fuel, fossil fuel, is 30% of the cost for airlines. And there is no possibility with current technologies to substitute for oil with other kinds of energy. So we can expect that the transportation system is going to come under great pressure, and that's especially important in Russia because you are such a big country and you have a relatively low road transportation system, so airlines are especially important in this country. I don't know about Russia, but in the West, 40% of all commercial freight is moved on passenger airline travel. So when the passenger airline travel goes down, the commercial freight starts to have more difficulty. And I see interesting new business opportunities in this area of moving freight around a big area under conditions which require much less energy. There's going to be lower discretionary income for luxuries, which means that basic consumption, food, housing, and so forth, transport, will be the big areas. Much more market for non-fossil energy. I don't know how you can get renewable energy really started in this country, but it's time. I mean, it needs legislation, technologies, it needs skilled personnel, and so forth. And needing much more efficient ways of producing the basic materials, food, goods, etc. For climate, there you can actually insulate Russia from climate change. But you can prepare Russia and the Russian economic and social system to deal with the unexpected shocks which are going to come because climate change is happening around the world. So that if suddenly some area of Russia, for example, has a big drought or floods, the shock of that doesn't cause serious damage across the country. When countries outside your borders start to have economic difficulties, you need to be structured in a way which offers flexibility here. This has enormous consequences in the agricultural sector, developing new techniques which can be very resilient under conditions of energy and water change. I could go on much longer, but I think more interesting to ask some questions. So I'm going to stop with just one more quick exercise, or two actually, I'm going to do two quick ones. Hoping that it shows you something about how to consider this lecture. You see, and this is the big problem. Again, it comes to this idea of thinking outside the box. We get into a set of habits, and they work, they're successful for us. And we start to think the world is always going to succeed with these habits. But then the conditions change. And we keep the old habits, and then it doesn't work anymore. So to be successful, you need to learn how to, first of all, understand when the habit isn't appropriate anymore, and then how to change. I'm going to give you some practice. Cross your arms. Everybody. This is serious now. You should do this. Okay. Look down and see which wrist is on top. So for me, at the moment, it's my left wrist. Okay? So remember, drop your hands. Good. Now, cross your arms. And look down and see which wrist is on top. Okay. Now we do a little scientific experiment. Everyone who had the same wrist up both times, raise your hand. Me too. So almost everybody. I guess it means there's some optimum technique here. So let's see. Everyone who had their left wrist up both times, raise your hand. Everyone who had your right wrist up both times, raise your hand. So it's about half and half. So everyone does it always the same way for themselves, but half of you are doing it one way and half of you are doing it the other. Which is fun, because crossing your arms is a habit that you use when you need to do something that doesn't require your arms. And it would be really a stupid waste of time every time you want to do something that doesn't need your arms if you spend 10 minutes sitting here trying to figure out what I should do with my arms. No, you have a habit. Cross them, and then you can get on with your business. It's perfect. Except sometimes your habits have to change. So let's see how you do that. Cross your arms the other way. This shows three things which apply also to my speech. First, it is possible to do it in a different way. Second, however, you have to think about it, and probably you will make mistakes at first. And third, it's not so comfortable. It isn't so pleasant to think about these problems. But if you do it for a while, then it becomes second nature. And now one more exercise which shows you about implementing your habit change. I want everyone in the room to clap their hands at precisely the same moment. So just like that. I'm show you how to do it. Don't do it yet. I'm going to count to 3. Slowly. 1, 2, 3. Then do it. Don't do it yet. I'll tell you when to do it. Okay, I'm going to count to 3. Then I will say clap. When I say that word, you do it. So it's very simple. I count to 3, then I say that word, and precisely when I say the word, you do it. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, clap. Actually, I wasn't trying to get applause. I wanted to show you an important point. You understood what I said, and actually you wanted to do what I said. But as soon as my actions were different from what I said, many of you, most actually, paid attention to my actions, not to my words. This is your challenge. If you go out and start to try and act with new habits, you're going to be in a world where people's behavior, their actions, are according to the old worldview. It will be very difficult for you to maintain your new habits in a world where the action is still according to the old ways. And that's a challenge for you. Thank you. Now comes the most important part of the program. We get to talk. And I should tell you that for 40 years, I have been criticized in Russia, so you don't need to worry about being impolite. You don't need to worry that I will be insulted, because I've heard all of these criticisms before. So please, what's interesting to you?
My name is Anton Chiduk. I'm Russian Green Building Council, and we actually the pioneers who spend a lot of time to popularize what you said in the lecture. But unfortunately, we very rare have such big audience like we have now here. And my question is about the actually predictions and what we have the forecast for the near future that we see in your presentation. Do you believe that this explains the potential of Russia and the potential, I mean, mainly in natural resources, is more dangerous for the country than the opportunity for the growth? Because what just small in your presentation was about China that will see that empty space, you know, for water and so on. So, do you see it's today it's more dangerous for us than an opportunity?
So if I simplify the question, is given the current circumstances for Russia, are there more dangers or more interesting opportunities? Yeah. So I'm no Russian specialist. I mean, when I had been here 5 times, then I was a Russian specialist. I could tell everybody everything about Russia. But now I've been here 50 times, and I realize I really don't know anything about this country. So I'll answer your question, but I'm not very sure that I'm right. When thinking about the future, we have to make a difference between theory and practice. In theory, there are wonderful opportunities for Russia. I mean, my goodness, you have a huge country, you have rather small population, you have a culture of excellent scientific foundations, and enormous resources. So that's the theory. From this, in theory, you could do something quite amazing. Then there's the practice, which you know better than I. So the question comes, can we change the practice in a way which realizes the theory? I don't know. It's possible. If I didn't think it was possible, I wouldn't bother to come over here and tell you to do it, because, I mean, it's silly to tell people to do something if there's absolutely no chance that it happens. And it depends a little bit on the surroundings, which we can't predict. Russia is enormously dependent on the export of oil now, enormously. You're moving to change that, and I hope you will succeed. But for the moment, this is really the major driver. The short-term prospects, means next 5, 10 years, have 2 contradictory trends. One, the price of oil stays high because it's running out in other countries. That's good. 2, the economies of the other consuming countries are damaged by the high prices, and they start to be a worse market for you, which means you export less. So I don't know how that's going to come out. In the old days, meaning in the 70s, I used to think it was important to know what's going to happen. I'm a manager. I like to have a plan. But now I understand no. I have what I call a Boy Scout ethic. Boy Scouts, is this association for boys, at least in my country. And the rule of the Boy Scouts is, one of the rules, leave your campsite better than you found it. So it should be just a little bit better than when you came. And, you know, if everyone in Russia would have the Boy Scout ethic, then you have fantastic possibilities. It doesn't take utopia. It just takes making things a little bit better.
Вы сегодня рассказывали о том, что куда мир катится, грубо говоря, да, что ресурсы исчерпываются, и в отношении бизнеса на ближайшие 50 лет стартапы будут наиболее удачными. Это все, что связано с водой, да? Вот. А как же в остальном? Где перспектива на ближайшие 50 лет? Что можете сказать? Спасибо.
So, I'll repeat the question because maybe somebody. So, she says that one interesting area for new startups will be in issues related to water. Yes, absolutely. The water crisis is a big problem. Will there be other areas? Absolutely. The transport system has to change. I mean, there are good reasons to change the car-based transport system in Russia anyway, but one is that oil becomes much more expensive. You know that this year Russia will become the biggest European market for cars. You're going to sell more cars in Russia than in Germany. So some people are very happy about that, but some people who have to leave Moscow, you know, during the rush hour aren't so happy. So all the other great European nations, capitals, Berlin, London, Paris, Vienna, are now developing new markets in transport. There are city-owned bicycle systems. There are new tax mechanisms to make it more expensive for cars to go into the central city. There are incentives for shared transportation. These changes will come also to Moscow, and they will open up very interesting possibilities. Food is an enormously important area of technology and commerce in Russia and the world. And that's an area where we see now major changes, a shift towards less intensive use of chemicals. In my country, shifting back from large-scale production units to smaller ones, which are located closer to the demand. New marketing mechanisms. When I moved to my house 20 years ago, the only place I could buy food was in a supermarket. Now, every day of the week, there is a market, someplace where farmers are selling what they produce themselves, and I'm able to go and to buy it. I think, well, and energy. Energy affects every single aspect of the economy. You are still living with a history of the time when energy was effectively without cost. I mean, therefore you don't have individual thermostats in your buildings. You know this from the communist time. The policy was basically not to worry about it. And this is going to change. So thermostats for the home, meters which let people understand something about their energy consumption. You know, I have, just as an example, as a trivia, I have in my house a freezer where I keep food. And I want to know, how much does it cost me to use this freezer? I can go now into the stores and buy several different devices which I put in just to that place and put in the freezer, and then after a week I could see precisely the amount I had to pay for the electricity for that freezer. It's an interesting market. Millions of those devices are being sold. So there are so many interesting new markets as soon as you understand that these changes are going to occur. The problem will be if you look, let's say, at the West, understand who's making money now, and try to copy them. Then you will be maximizing for a system which is about to disappear.
Do you think that globalization overall is the biggest issue for economy today, and it would be better for, say, our energy resources if the economy will become more localized and smaller among, all the businesses, because they're so big.
Well, of course, this is a very intelligent question which could be the basis for a 2-day seminar. I give you my quick answer. Historically, if we look at over the last couple hundred years, the countries which have developed a high level of economy have, in the early phases, blocked imports. The United States, Brazil, China, India didn't immediately globalize. They encouraged domestic manufacture even though it was more expensive in order to build up their own capacity. And only after they really had quite a sophisticated economy did they globalize. So does that mean that Russia should do this? I don't know. That's a complicated question, and I wouldn't want to give a simple answer for it. But I know the economists in the West have this mythology about the globalized economy. For me personally, I think that's a sophisticated way of a new kind of colonialism. It's using the economic system to do what they used to do in the old days in other ways. And so what I could say is at least you shouldn't accept the answer that you get from economists on this. You should sit down, look at your own conditions, and decide what's the best answer for you. And very likely it will be that in certain sectors you shouldn't globalize at first. You should tolerate inefficient, expensive local production, because that's always what happens in the early phases before you can build up. So of course, we're speaking about complicated problems here, and one thing to say, no complicated problem has a simple answer. So even my simple answers are only a very partial, but so that's it. Thank you.
Вы говорите про изменения, например, транспортной системы в Москве или про индивидуальный контроль потребления энергии, да, в каждой семье отдельно взятой. Вот для меня это звучит как некая потребность в изменении уровня индивидуального сознания. Немножко сказала сложно, да, но то есть требует некой перестройки мышления каждого отдельного человека. Вот как вы видите, с этим необходимо работать, на каком уровне, там, это какое-то образование в школе должно происходить или какие-то иные методы? Спасибо.
So, to summarize, she asks, or she says, it seems like we need a paradigm shift in order to deal with these problems, and how do we do that? I'm happy to tell you it's not so difficult as that. We don't need a paradigm shift. We need different behavior. Now, the current paradigm can give very different behavior if the information is different. I give you an example. In the United Kingdom, there was a really big housing development. I don't know, some thousands of houses were put into this district. Half of the houses had a water meter at the kitchen sink. So actually, when you turn the faucet, you see the meter. Half the houses had a water meter in the basement. In the houses where the water meter was in the kitchen sink, water consumption was half of the other houses. The people had the same paradigm in both places, only in the first place they had different information. They could see every time they turned the faucet, it's costing them something. And so they changed their habits. I take a totally different thing. I did for many years consulting for companies. I was an industrial consultant. And often we found that the leaders of the firm, of the company, needed to behave in a different way in order to solve some problem. Typically, we found that simply giving them new information would produce the necessary behavior. They behaved in a stupid way, not because they were stupid, not because they wanted to be stupid, but because they didn't know what to do. And by gathering data someplace where it existed already and making it available to the leaders, they just changed it. Now, that won't solve all problems, of course. But I can tell you, in your country, certainly in my country, it's a great place to start. You can achieve amazing changes in behavior simply thinking about the information which is available to people. Thanks.